Today is Wednesday, July 23rd, 2014. My name is Jason Higgins, and I'm an intern with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at the OSU Library. I'm in Stillwater to interview Major General Douglas Dollar and discuss his military career as well as his time at OSU. This is part of the Spotlighting Oklahoma Oral History Project. Mr. Dollar, thank you for joining me today. Let's begin with when and where you were born.
I was born in November 1944 in Sallisaw, Oklahoma. My dad was a section gang foreman on the railroad, and they were just temporarily in town, and that's where I was born.
Okay. And did you travel with your family?
Yeah, we moved to Kansas, and then when I was about 3, actually, though, he left the railroad and bought a farm in Muldrow, Oklahoma.
Oh, okay.
Then we moved to Van Buren, Arkansas. Then we moved out to Lake Tenkiller, Oklahoma, in Cherokee County, which had just been built by the Corps of Engineers, and that's basically where I grew up. Went to Tahlequah High School.
Okay. Talk a little bit about Tahlequah. What was it like growing up there?
Oh, it was fascinating. Well, first of all, I grew up out on the lake, Tenkiller, in a little community called Cookson. The Cookson, that's the heart of the Cookson Hills, and 2-room schoolhouse. When we arrived there in about 1953, it had wood-burning stoves. The first kid at school would start the fire, and it had outhouses, 2-seater outhouses. They pretty quickly upgraded. When they built the lake, they had moved the community, the school, the general store, the church, out away from it. Was all that was covered by water. So, I mean, it was like the road from Vian to Tahlequah was dirt, gravel road. It was like, I look back on it and I think it was like moving back to the 1920s or 30s. That quickly changed. You know, that lake greatly helped develop that area. Of course, that's the western capital of the Cherokee Nation was Tahlequah. So lots of history about the Cherokee and about outlaws and stuff that I was fascinated with as a kid.
Did you go to school with Cherokee?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Matter of fact, I'm part Cherokee. I finally found out in my genealogy work that I'm able to prove it. My great-great-grandmother was Cherokee, and in Tennessee, in the 1840s, if you don't mind some family history, $3 brothers coming from North Carolina married 3 Cherokee sisters. The romance was a secondary condition. I think in those days you had to get married and have a family. So by 1850, they were in Arkansas, as I was telling you earlier. 2 years ago, I organized a family reunion in Greers Ferry, Arkansas, and to finally locate some distant relatives and stuff. So anyway, yes, Cherokee County, lots of young friends, Cherokees. Maybe everybody was part Cherokee. Tahlequah Tigers, it was, and we had our 50th class reunion just last October. And that was a lot of fun. And Tahlequah's doubled about in size. The area is so much more developed than it was then, because they had just opened the lake, and that country had been isolated to a large extent during the up into through the 40s. By today's standards, it's changed a lot now.
Do you come from a large family? Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have one sister.
Okay.
Not a large family. Of course, my dad, he had 2 brothers. My mother had 2 brothers, or 3 brothers actually. So, and they were all from Arkansas.
Okay.
And we wound up in Oklahoma somehow.
Did you work while you were in school, high school, grade school?
I got to work at a drugstore as a soda jerk. That's something that doesn't exist as an occupation anymore, I guess. I mowed yards a lot, and then ultimately I worked on the boat dock on Lake Tenkiller, which was kind of fun job. But that's what I did growing up, mainly. when I came to college here at OSU, I did various things, but I was advertising and newspaper management major, so I started doing things kind of related to that when I was in school to support my way through school. Unlike today, when you hear about the enormous debt students acquire, you could work your way through school in those days.
Absolutely.
And it was not hard to do, really, as I look back. I did get a National Defense student loan. I think it's $950, which seemed like a lot of money that I did pay back. And but I don't think I could have really probably gotten by without it. And then I was in ROTC, and when I entered my junior year in ROTC, they offered some scholarships. I got a 2-year scholarship that finished me out.
Well, let's talk about your path to OSU. Were you influenced by anyone to go to OSU? How did you get to
first
OSU?
started, it was through the 4-H program. That was one of the few things you could get involved in there. In grade school, I got involved in 4-H. And they had the roundup here at OSU, and came up here, loved the campus. It seemed like an exciting place after being out in the country. And of course it is. Then my brother-in-law and sister moved here for a while he completed a master's degree here back still when I was in grade school, and I'd come to visit them. So I went to Northeastern in Tahlequah 1 year and decided it would be good to come up here and be in to get in ROTC and to be at OSU. So then in the next year in '64 I came here.
Interesting.
And
so you graduated high school in '63, right?
'63, went to Northeastern a year.
Talk a little bit about growing up and being educated under the Cold War era, the Kennedy administration. There was, the missile crisis. How did that Cold War rhetoric affect you, if at all, to going into the military?
Well, I don't think it did. I look back on the Cold War period. I've talked to my wife, who was in school here in Stillwater when she was young, and she remembers bomb shelters being for sale downtown, and I remember that. But I think moving out to the Cookson, maybe I missed a lot of that. I was always interested in the military for some reason. I felt it was, I admired the idea of being a military person. And so it wasn't the Cold War that affected me. And of course I was aware of these things. I don't ever remember being especially afraid.
Do you remember whenever Kennedy was assassinated?
Oh, yes. I was attending Northeastern, and I walked into the student union one morning, and a good friend of mine told me the president had been shot. We were astounded. I mean, it was, I think today we wouldn't, well, I'm older, but I think people were more innocent or less cynical then. It was, and he was popular, so very popular, and it was just devastating to people. I think most people who lived through that can remember. My wife says she was here in school in Stillwater and remembers them taking them out of class into the auditorium to announce that. I remember watching television when Oswald was shot, and just as it happened too, So people were glued to the TV, of course, for the news after that.
Absolutely. We'll talk a little bit about ROTC. What was emphasized during training? Did you meet friends? Talk a little bit about your role in that.
I was very involved in ROTC. In those days, the training was basically infantry training. I think the different schools were based on different programs. Maybe some were artillery oriented. It was just like being trained to be an infantry lieutenant. A lot of history courses. It was I actually published 2 volumes of history of the Army Cadet Command, so I've been able to go back and look at this a little, how it's involved. Of course, they've changed it all since then. The program was huge. As a land grant institution, the first 2 years as a freshman and sophomore, you were required to take ROTC. So they had a whole ROTC brigade of 4 battalions and 2 drill days. There were thousands of young men in the program. Young women were not required to take it. And so it was huge. I was the officers and NCOs who were the cadre. It was quite large. A colonel was in charge. They became role models for me, mentors, very much so. And I was involved in student organizations in it, like Pershing Rifles and Scabbard and Blade, were 2 well-known in those days organizations within the ROTC, extracurricular. And basically, my friends were from ROTC. I was heavily involved in it. Too much, probably, but could have worked more on my grades, but I came out okay. Grade-wise, too.
You were a distinguished military graduate, right?
Yes.
So apparently it didn't affect your grades too negatively.
Yeah, they might have awarded those a lot on your participation in ROTC or what they thought was your potential. You got in those days they gave regular Army commissions and reserve commissions, and so I got a regular Army commission as if it'd gone to West Point or whatever, like they used to do. Now it's not that way anymore, but it was then. Of course, I was really in the journalism department here, and I enjoyed those courses and so forth. I was not an avid student there, but my GPA for the day was good. It was really good. But yeah, I was totally immersed in the ROTC program.
So whenever you graduated from ROTC, what was the likelihood in your mind of going to Vietnam at that point?
Oh, I knew I was going, and I volunteered.
How did you prepare yourself for that mentally?
When I look back on it, I say I didn't prepare myself well enough. I got married here just before I left OSU, and not the wife I have now, my first wife, and that really, I look back on it and think that was not a smart thing to do, because of the moving and the chance of being killed or hurt in Vietnam. We went to Fort Bragg in June of '68. The Army allowed me to stay an extra year after I graduated to get commissioned and go to graduate school. So I actually went a year to graduate school while I was my last year here.
And was that under the GI Bill at that point?
No, it was. I had a scholarship through ROTC. They allowed me to continue that. And I should have finished the master's degree, but I was very busy in ROTC and other things. I was the junior battalion commander, and I organized field exercises for the cadets and everything. I was very involved in it. I did enjoy grad school a great deal, the courses I had. But in June of '68, I graduated in May of '68. Actually, I had my bachelor's degree a year earlier. I got commissioned in May of '68. There were about 200 of us, I think, at least. And a friend and I pinned our gold bars on each other. It was not an elaborate ceremony then. I just spoke at the officer commissioning this last here at OSU. And it's a much nicer ceremony now, and very impressive. The young people are commissioning as lieutenants, but it was a big program then. So by June, my wife and I got in our car, drove to Fayetteville, North Carolina, Fort Bragg, and I signed up for the 82nd Division then.
So you said that you had volunteered. What led to that decision to volunteer?
Well, I felt I had a duty, and I saw myself being a career officer. It probably was just a gesture. I don't know. I think they might have probably. Chances are, I'd have been sent as a lieutenant anyway. Now I do know they had captains come in like into our unit when I was in Vietnam, that maybe had gone to Europe and then came to Vietnam as a captain. I don't think that was a good deal. I think, you needed to get in and understand what you were doing. But would I do it again now that I'm older and wiser? I'd have to think about it. But, I think most of us knew we were probably going to Vietnam. And it took about a year. It was the typical thing. You would go to a unit, you would go to I went to jump school first because I was in 82nd. Then I went to infantry officer basic course. Then I went to ranger school. And then I was in a company in the 82nd, and we had some field training. One big exercise, I flew to Korea and jumped in on the Han River. Our whole brigade. It was quite an experience. I was the jump master for that. So it was a year of training and some unit, actually training with a unit as a leader, not much.
Let's talk a little bit about that. The 82nd is a elite force. Can you talk a little bit about the training in the 82nd?
Well, I'm going to talk. Yeah, let me talk about training because that influenced my whole career. I thought I had a couple of great company commanders, and did try to do a lot of good field training, but it was limited. One thing I learned about the Army through my career, the Army traditionally put a lot of money into their schools programs, and it was excellent training, although it was brief. The unit training, I always felt, and I'll get into that, was never what I thought it should be. Because but I'm sure most of the units in the Army were very similar in their training. There were a lot of jumps. You had to jump ever so often. It was based around airborne training, being inserted by parachute jump. The field training was limited, I thought, to what it could be. Of course, I was looking at it from a lieutenant who was going to Vietnam and then would have a platoon and needed to learn all you could. I know I read a lot. I read a lot of accounts about Vietnam. The war, by the time I was ready to go to Vietnam, President Nixon had been elected on the promise to wind down the war, and I think morale was already hurting. When I went to the 82nd, the soldiers there, most of them had been to Vietnam in the units, and their morale was not great, I felt. They were great people, great soldiers, but they had been through a lot. Introduced to drugs, that was kind of a problem with a lot of soldiers. And the stories I heard from them, I think one of the best training events I had, they had a duty officer position, and you would stay in the headquarters at night, like the brigade headquarters. And I was in there with an NCO, a Vietnam veteran who was probably an E6 or an E7 by the time I was talking to him, staff sergeant. And he was telling me how as a squad leader he worked with his squad and guided the point man and stuff. All night we talked. I think he told me some stories to try to scare this young lieutenant. But actually during that conversation I acquired a lot of ideas to use. I don't want to jump around on you. When I got to Vietnam, there were no NCOs in the field with the unit. They had all either been casualties or had done so many tours. The highest ranking man in my rifle platoon was a E4, a specialist. It was kind of like on-the-job training. There were no seasoned NCOs. We had a field first sergeant. He was on his third tour. He was pretty experienced, but that was one NCO in the whole rifle company. The captain was a great guy, and he was on about his third tour also. When, the 82nd was a great organization. But by that time, the war had been going on, for 4 years intently by that time. And it had begun to tear down the Army a lot, I think. I remember as a cadet at OSU, we made a field trip to Fort Riley, Kansas, and the 1st Infantry Division, we visited them. Shortly after that, they were deployed to Vietnam. And the Army was that was probably 64. It was definitely a spit polish Army. These were old wooden barracks. The barrack floors were spit shined. The shoes and the uniforms were dress all lined up. And I'll never forget, the platoon leader was showing us the barracks, and we went into the latrine. Now, these are old World War II barracks, but they were fixed up. And somebody had left a little bit of toothpaste in the sink, and he looked at it and he said, "This platoon will stay up all night GIing the barracks." That was the discipline. Now, how much, of course, that's to teach attention to detail, which is it is important in combat, to make sure the weapons are right, make sure all the planning is right. Every detail you can think of is taken care of. There is a purpose for it. So, but that, you won't see that. You didn't see that in the Army I entered in '68. It had, I know I went through an exercise trying to get my platoon through one of those inspections, and it was just too much to overcome. We did have NCOs, good NCOs in the 82nd. They often were like Korean War veterans as well as Vietnam. Sometimes you'd run into a World War II veteran if he was a sergeant major or so forth. So that's the kind of Army you had. It was, it had a lot of combat experience, but it didn't stay in the field in Vietnam except a little bit, in my view, the kind of where I went. Now, maybe the divisions were different. When the AmeriCal division was a much maligned organization. I actually volunteered for it because when I was at Fort Bragg, I opened a Army's magazine, and they said, "We're standing up a new division," and it was the 23rd Infantry, the AmeriCal. And I thought that was interesting. They had actually formed it from 4 light infantry regiment, independent infantry brigades that had been deployed separately. And then
they formed it in Vietnam, right?
Yes, they did. They put those, and so it was the Army's largest division at the time. It was huge. I've done some research on it later and was surprised to find out it eventually was evolved into an air mobile division, which was the new concept. But you think of the 1st Cav when they were deployed there, that was air mobile. That was a new concept, deploying troops by helicopter. And you think of Vietnam, you think of the helicopter, the Huey helicopter. But I got back from Vietnam, I read a lot about it. It was known as the Hard Luck Division, surprisingly. My Lai occurred in the AmeriCal, which was it was in Quang Ngai Province where we were. My Lai was in the battalion AO next to ours. In Vietnam, there was not front lines. It was like you see in Afghanistan today, and units had areas of operation. I give PowerPoint talks to groups about Vietnam, and I have an old map that I carried, and I have gotten off the internet. I'd say, maybe 10 or 15 miles one way and the other, and in for infinity into the mountains. But My Lai was about 7 miles from from basically most of the area we operated in. I guess the defining moment when I arrived in country, and they had a 2-week training school, and then they sent me to the 1st to 52nd Infantry, and I went in, and there was a major there, the battalion XO, and he said, "Lieutenant Dollar, we're sending you to C Company. They've just set off a booby trap, an artillery round wired in a tree in a night position they took, and it killed the company commander and 3 other soldiers and wounded a lot of other soldiers. Because this is a 105 artillery round the enemy had picked up that had not exploded and rigged it in this old perimeter. They made the mistake of going in there. And he started and he said, well, you need to, when you get to your platoon, they're scared. You need to start getting them out on patrol. You need to shape them up, da-da-da-da-da. And I thought, boy, what a pep talk. I thought, my morale is soaring right now, you know. But when I got to the company, they were on the fire base. The AOs tended to have an artillery fire base in the center. The battalion or tactical operations center was there. The forward battalion, and of course I had been talking to this major in the battalion rear in the July, the division area. So so I got with the company, and frankly I was pretty scared at that point on my way over. But once I got with the troops, it ended. I saw them, and here I am. There's no turning back. You know, this is. So we went out to the field the same day, and we got mortared after the same day when we got in the field. And I remember the field first sergeant coming up to me, and he kept talking to me and looking in my eyes. And I realized he's just seeing how I reacted to this, you know. So there we were, mainly just kids out there. Now there were the other lieutenants there. The guy I replaced was either wounded or killed. I forget the lieutenant, but you know, those lieutenants they had been there maybe just a month before me or so. I mean, it was. And most of the soldiers, some may have been in the field several months, but, you know, imagine this. We were in there, and the enlisted soldiers had probably gone to a year of training, like the lieutenants.
Before we go further, I have quite a few questions.
I'm sorry, I'm running off.
You brought up a lot of interesting aspects to Vietnam. I'll try to take this chronologically. First, with your training in the 82nd, you mentioned that you thought that they could have done a better job. Was this still highly conventional warfare, or were they starting to implement more guerrilla?
Good question. We trained in the unit in conventional methods. And I think the Army, you read the history. I later was in Special Forces, and the Army was hesitant, is the standard view you read of history, didn't want to lose track of Europe and think of a conventional war, I think.
Right.
It was, if you read the history books, slow to embrace counterinsurgency methods. And, you know, I thought as we were out there, in retrospect, after my years of experience, a rifle company is a clumsy thing to fight an insurgency with. You know, you're walking around or patrolling with, now we were never at full strength. The rifle company should have been about 200 soldiers. It was usually less than 100, almost always. But, you know, you're traveling around with these large number of men subject to be casualties, you know, because they're out there just like that booby trap when I arrived in the country. They're setting, anticipating your move, trying to get out ahead and set booby traps. The enemy has a bad habit of not cooperating, and they try to stay alive, and they try to kill you, you know. So, yes, our training in the States was essentially, I felt, conventional warfare.
Okay.
You did get some exposure ideas to, but even in infantry officer basic, Ranger School was great training, and because it was small unit patrolling, raids, and so it was more like to what you might be able to depend on.
And you mentioned on-the-job training, the first day you heard of the prior officer being killed. Then you experienced a mortar round on your first time out. So how aware were you upon arriving in Vietnam of the possibility of mines, of booby traps, of punji sticks, of snipers, the dangers of Vietnam?
Well, you were told about that, and like an enlisted soldiers, many went through their training, basic and advanced infantry training at like Fort Polk, Louisiana, and they had a section down there. I think they called it Tigerland, and it was most places had a Vietnam village they made, and you would practice you'd train going into it, and they'd show you some of the like tunnels and booby traps, so you were aware of them. But this is my whole point of my experience in the Army, and I'm getting to the Army. I saw amazing transformation in the Army. I was privileged to see during my career. But everybody, the booby traps, certainly, everybody was obsessed with that, and they seemed to think everything was booby trapped. And yet we had many encounters that involved small arms fire. And but so you had both. You know, you tried to use cover and concealment, but the VC would, or the Viet Cong or whatever, who lived in the area could often anticipate your moves and they didn't have enough stuff to booby trap everything or mine everything. They had to dig up a lot of their stuff from artillery rounds that didn't go off and so forth, or even bombs, 500-pound bombs that might not explode. They would try to dig those up and make devices. So, and I experienced that. They would get out ahead of us. We might have a firefight, and they would probably anticipated several routes we might take and get ahead and set booby traps for us. That's my point. I think we could have been better prepared for that, certainly as lieutenants. Now later, we did get non-commissioned officers. They were young though. They were like lieutenants. They called them shake and bakes, but it was the beginning of the non-commissioned officer course program, and they were soldiers who did well in basic and advanced infantry training, and then they would send them to some extra training to be NCOs. And that was an improvement, definitely. You did finally have NCOs. And matter of fact, one of my platoon sergeants later became a U.S. congressman from Georgia. I tell people I should have treated him better, but which I like to mention because the Vietnam veteran was so criticized and ridiculed, and I think very unfairly. But anyway, my point is we learned this on the job training to a large extent, and that always bugged me. That was my feeling. I'm sure there are people that would argue with me. They might say I didn't pay enough attention in training. But I thought, and the point I want to get to in my career, I later, because of that, when I got back from Vietnam, I did want to stay airborne. I got in Special Forces. When I left active duty, I was the training officer for the 5th Special Forces Group, which had been redeployed to Fort Bragg by that time. So I got interested in training, and in my career, beginning in the 80s, the Army vastly focused on unit training and training methods and tremendous improvement. And I know before I retired, I went back to Fort Bragg, and I was so impressed with the non-commissioned officers. They had their younger, highly motivated, well-trained. And I saw a system. I got to see the system of unit training and individual training that evolved in the unit. And but by the time I retired, I ultimately commanded the 80th Training Division in Richmond, Virginia, but it covered several states, and is a reserve component division. And yet, we trained up and deployed almost 800 soldiers by the time of my retirement to go to Iraq and train the new Iraqi army. Now, these are reserve soldiers, and that is a Special Forces mission. That's how far the Army was stretched at that time, but these were still excellent soldiers I got to see that evolution, that evolved to that.
Absolutely.
So I hope the Army, I think it will maintain its focus on training. All these deployments have certainly taken their toll on all the services, but the Army has, but I think I've been retired over 9 years, so you get out of touch in that time, but they tried to deploy the soldiers as units. They did, and that's a big advantage too, because they go back to states, they would train together and then deploy together instead of individual replacements like Vietnam, going in and being told you're replacing a guy who was wounded or dead, and then you go to the field. So and I think and you can still read the resistance to embracing counterinsurgency training. It's still controversial. Petraeus, was a big advocate and wrote the new FM on that, and it's still debated. It looks like, though, we are tied to counterinsurgency doctrine, whether we like it or not, in the Army. And it is, I read a lot. I read people who criticize the military for not being able to adapt. This is a hard thing to deal with, because the enemy's going to not just go by the book, they're going to adapt too. And so you need small unit leaders who are innovative and can adapt to the situation. We've got lots of brave soldiers making tremendous sacrifices, and we were talking earlier about the sad thing of suicides and everything. It's a brutal type warfare. Not to say, I know a lot of World War II veterans. I go to their reunions. That was extremely brutal. There's something, though, about going day in and day out and having casualties and not really being able to fight back, it seems like.
Absolutely.
That's part of the
Well, you mentioned
with it.
adapting, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about in the first couple of weeks in Vietnam, and you mentioned that the men looked to you after the mortar fire. What did you learn from the men under you, ranking below you in the field on the job training, and how did they look to you as a good leader in the field? What qualities make a good leader in the field?
Well, I feel funny talking about myself and thinking what the troops may have thought of me.
Well,
I made a point to try to go around and get to know the soldiers. By the time I went to Vietnam, I said, my main mission is to try to keep soldiers alive and from getting hurt, because the war we were backing out of the war by then. And I thought it's a shame to lose lives when the country's probably going to pull out. But what makes a good leader in the field? I think, having retired after 37 years in the Army and trained people in leadership and so forth, I think the first thing is a concern for the soldiers. One thing they used to say in Vietnam, leaders didn't want to get to know the soldiers too well. They didn't want that attachment when something happened to them. But I think it's absolutely essential that a leader see themselves. It's a privilege to be a leader, I think, in the military, in the Army. You're taught in the infantry to take care of soldiers. The mission is the first priority, and right there closely with it is to take care of the soldiers. And so I think to get to know the soldiers, to give them encouragement, technically and tactically proficient is a term I remember a lot. I know when I got to Vietnam and that happened, that was my first thought. They haven't trained me enough to do this after 4 years of ROTC and a year of training. I think I would have said that under any circumstances probably, but I think had I known, now I had a wife and I was at Bragg, and I would have spent more time trying to learn that profession of arms, being an infantry officer. Certainly that. People are very different, and the military naturally, like any organization, has a mold they want to fit you in, but everybody's individual. So I think everybody you have principles, but then the individual has to fill that role as best fits them. But certainly the principle of not being for yourself, but you're committed to the troops, I think, to learn. And that may take time to learn.
Right.
As funny as that sounds, but sometimes we're more focused on ourselves than we realize. But
can you take us through maybe some of the difficulties of learning on the job, a specific experience for you?
Well, I can think of mistakes I made, things I did right and mistakes. Now, you got to realize in combat, in Vietnam especially, it's day in and day out, nothing happening, so you get careless. They called it the Widowmaker syndrome. I remember right after we got mortared, the next day or two, the company commander said, grab your stuff. We moved out. I didn't have enough water with me, but we had a Vietnamese who was supposed to be a spy, and he was taking us to a cache of arms and weapons, and we were coming out in the field, and the Vietnamese guy that was supposed to be the spy he went berserk and said, don't come out here. And just as he was doing that and the company commander was arguing with him, we started receiving small arms fire. The sergeant next to me was hit in the leg. I could feel the bullets surround me. A bullet ricocheted off my helmet. Wasn't touched other than that. So it was pandemonium, and we all hit the ground, and the forward observer, field artillery, started trying to call in artillery fire. And he was behind some obstruction and couldn't see well and didn't know what to do. He didn't see where the rounds land. These people were probably 300 yards, 500 yards away from us. They had fired from a knoll. I ran up to try to help him, and I gave just the classic mistake. Instead of telling him to add 200 yards, I said drop 200 yards. Well, the artillery rounds came almost on top of us. I mean, it's impressive to be, but that's a mistake I made. And it didn't hurt anybody, so I was lucky. Another time, I'll cut it short. You learn by trial and error. And in the infantry, I was basically leading the platoon, not necessarily a squad leader. That's where those things that the squad leader told me, because the platoons were under strength. About half the size they should have been. A rifle platoon would normally have been 44 men. They were usually 20 or less. But I remember one day they kept worrying about things being mined, and I was leading the company with my platoon, and we were coming to a village, and I don't want to get into too much detail, so stop me, but we were skirting a rice paddy, and there were woods.
Details are good for the oral history.
So I was leading with my platoon, and I said, well, we're silhouetted out here, and we could start receiving small arms fire and take casualties. So I cut into the woods. I didn't know it at the time. The field first sergeant was cursing me because he said, well, this area, he told me later, this area is mined. They're going to be, we're going to run into the mines. Because even he, after 3 years of experience, was under the idea that all these areas were permanently mined. So I went in, and all of a sudden we ran into a young female Vietnamese and a young male. They were armed. We killed them. This young female was actually a legend. She was the leader of the platoon, a group of VC or guerrillas in the area. They had killed a lieutenant I knew who took his platoon into that area a few weeks before. So I did the right thing, even though this first sergeant thought I was doing the wrong thing. Just a slight decision. We went on. We received sniper fire. We were out piddling around. Again, he had my platoon lead. We came to we crossed this old French railroad track. We came up to a fairly swift stream, and you could go across the railroad track on the bridge. Now, I had been worried about small arms fire. I hesitated because I say if we crossed that track, we were still close to the woods, we could receive small arms fire. But the point man went ahead and went across it. I was hesitant because the stream was obviously going to be hard to cross. And I thought, well, he got across without anything happening, so we followed. After we went across, about the third man behind me set off a booby trap. So see, they had gotten ahead of us and set out booby traps. So I made a mistake then, and it resulted in casualties. So you're day in and day out, nothing happens. You're tired, you're worn out, and you should be alert all the time. And then you're making these minute little decisions, often with nothing as a result to say, oh, I learned something there, didn't learn something. That's what it was like. It was learning on the job, but it wasn't in a classroom. The result were people getting hurt. When I got back from Vietnam years later, infantry school at Fort Benning used to put out a magazine. I don't think they do anymore, infantry magazine, and I found an article by a battalion commander in the Marical, and he talked about how the enemy operated. And he said, they would trail units and anticipate and get out ahead of them and set booby traps and stuff like that. He said things that I should have learned at least when I went into in-country with the little 2-week school they had for the division that didn't, as I remember, didn't focus on things like that. And my point is, we could have been better prepared, I thought. We were not professionals like the Army today, which is so much better. And I would think, from what I've seen us train, I think the Army does tremendous job now in preparing units. But the tendency of a large organization is to become a bureaucracy and become casual back in the States, I think about. And yet the soldiers that have been deployed so much now, they need to be able to get away from that some. And you truly have professionals at all levels in the Army today. This is the life they've chosen. I admire them for it. I know it's hard on them, it's hard on their families. They have learned, I think, probably even with that though, to a large extent on the job. I went down to Fort Benning again to a Ranger School graduation of a friend's son who was a West Point graduate, and he had just completed Ranger School. Got to know him. He finally got out of the Army, I met him someplace, and I said he had been to Iraq by then and been in firefights as a platoon leader. And I said, well, what was it like, your first firefight? Because these were in cities, built-up areas. And he said, well, first firefight we got into, he said, the NCOs mainly took care of that. So, and that's the NCO's job. A lieutenant is there to learn, really, in my view. That's where you start an officer's career, like in the infantry, as an infantry lieutenant. They're there learning. They're leading, yes, but it's a big learning curve. And the NCOs are the people that have the experience. They're not a green lieutenant. And they will, almost all the NCOs, good NCOs will take the lieutenant, and there's that relationship where the lieutenant learns from the trade at small unit level.
You brought up a point that I wanted to come back to, if you don't mind my asking. You were operating in South Vietnam, and there was a lot of civilians with the possibility of VC. Right? How did you learn on the job to distinguish civilian from VC?
You find that you distinguish them when they shoot at you. That's the young military age males to begin with. A young male of military age could not avoid either being in the South Vietnamese Army or being taken into the VC or our main force Viet Cong regiments. So you never saw young men around. And if you did, and they were not in the South Vietnamese Army, then they were VC probably.
How did you go into villages and these search missions? Can Can you take us through an event where you go through
Yeah.
a village like that?
The area we were in, by the time I was there, they had moved, part of the pacification program, they had moved people into secure villages. So the idea the VC couldn't tax them, couldn't intimidate them. These were supposed to be secure. Of course, we didn't have enough people to secure them. And one after that incident I told you where we killed the 2 VC and we hit the booby trap, my platoon was left to protect a village like that. And we had with us what they call Kit Carsons, were people who had either been a VC or NVA soldier, and they had surrendered, and now they had bought into, and they were guides for us. And I thought these were terrific soldiers. They were our main communication with the civilians. The civilians were very friendly. The villages we went into, in other words, by that time were secure.
Okay.
It's not like we went in expecting to have a firefight, like happened at My Lai a year or more before. By that time, the area had been totally changed, the situation. Now, if we went up in the mountains, that wasn't part of that. It was different, because if you ran into a camp there, it was the enemy's camp. So, so it's not like maybe a year or two before, where I think we would have been going into villages and maybe surrounding it. We did try to surround the village at night one time, and there were VC in it, but it got bungled near the end. My platoon was leading a night movement. We had planned it out, and can I start at the beginning of that story? It's
Please.
a good illustration of things that go wrong.
Please.
Since my platoon was going to lead us on this night march and surround this village they thought VC were in, the battalion S3 came and he took me up in the chopper, and we did fly. We didn't fly over the village, fortunately, to show that we were coming, but he was showing me the village, and we were looking at the terrain. Now, this is rice paddies and bamboo hedgerows, and he said, "Look, you can't miss that village. There's that big bomb crater in the middle." Now, we're going to be at night on flat terrain on the ground. That bomb crater was nothing. It wouldn't make a bit of difference. The only way we would find it is, compass and pacing and so forth. And it just illustrates, here this major at battalion level, who was the Battalion 3, our operations officer, was so out of touch with what it was like, to be an infantry platoon leader on the ground. A small thing illustrates some of the... So anyway, I saw it. We prepared. My platoon was in the lead. Where we messed up was when I was thinking we were going to go right around the village like that and meet up, but they stopped us and wanted to let the other platoon catch up and go around, and we do a pincer and meet. That was decided, there on the ground in the middle of the night. So that gave them time. Dogs were barking and stuff, and after we did surround it, we were there, and then we received fire from outside the village, because they heard us coming and they got out and set up. That was one time when we tried to enter a village we considered hostile, and that's what it was like. And in a war, a lot of shooting goes along, a small arms fire, with often not many people getting hit, or usually under the circumstances. That was one instance. Could have been really bad, but it was at night, and they were maybe firing at sounds or more than anything. The thing is, I have some pictures in my talk from Vietnam, and there are some beautiful young Vietnamese kids in a hammock there, young girls and boys. And I say, these beautiful kids, they probably were telling the VC where we were all the time, and that's true. They were caught up in the conflict. Kids would come around, they would want candy and stuff, but they were probably telling the enemy what we were doing too, because they were there. The VC, I'm sure, never really left for very often. they lived there. We came through in armed groups, and that's what I think is so good about the Special Forces mission and working with the people there, the soldiers of that country and so forth, because we did not understand the culture. We did not know what we were in. We were just young kids that had been there a few months, you know. I guess I'm sounding awfully negative, but it affected my whole outlook
like
on the military.
Learned a lot from that experience, and you've applied that throughout your career. Well, the AmeriCal, you've brought up My Lai a couple of times, so I guess there's no avoiding the question of My Lai, and the AmeriCal is associated in some sort with that. At the time while you were on the ground in Vietnam, were you aware of the incident? How
I learned about My Lai. I got there in July, and then at Christmas, our company was lucky enough to come up on the fire base and defend the fire base. So we were on the fire base during Christmas. A Life magazine was there. I opened it up, and it was a story about My Lai. I had never heard about it. It was shocking. It had these vivid pictures of American soldiers doing this. And as I looked at it, I said, well, you know, I thought, God, this looks familiar. You know, Vietnam, like any country, there's the mountains, there's down in the Delta. This terrain looked awfully familiar in the villages. Well, it was just a few miles away from where I was sitting at that moment that it happened a year before. Quang Ngai province, I read later, was considered a very difficult area. It was, has been described, an old Viet Minh. Viet Minh were the ones fighting the French before we got there. Vietnamese
nationalists.
Now, stronghold. There were lots of booby traps, as I've described, and besides My Lai, there were 3 other massacres that occurred in Quang Ngai province, and I didn't know that. These were by South Korean troops. As you know, South Korea sent 2 divisions to help fight the war, and they were probably more hardcore than most American units. So there had been at least 4 major massacres occurred in My Lai. So in that province, it was very difficult. To this day, I can look and go on the internet and see pictures, and it's shocking. And yet, I think you know, I'm not just an observation. If you go day in and day out, seeing buddies hurt, killed, and you can't fight back, in essence. You cannot find somebody to fight. You know, it's a dangerous situation. It requires strong leadership. If you read about what happened at My Lai, I think Medina, the company commander, pretty much set that situation up. And it was different than when we were there. I never saw an atrocity. I saw people killed, bodies. They were always combatants. I saw dead women, like the one I described. They were combatants. I can see how it could happen. It's not right, but it requires strong leadership because you become inured to violence.
Did you have that observation at the time, or was that in hindsight?
No, it developed at the time, and mainly after hindsight, reflecting on it. I did realize you become inured to violence because I experienced it, you know. I was so bothered by seeing things, but you get to where it's different. It's not the same, but I think there was a lesson from that. I think the Army's leadership now is so trained and stuff, it would be of course, much less likely to happen, but I wouldn't ever rule it out. Any nationality, any group of people, and there are always some people that are more capable of things like that than others. So it's something that would, again, small unit leadership is the key to controlling that and keeping it from happening.
Well, you mentioned that you were working in pacified villages. What were some of the benefits that you saw of American involvement in Vietnam as far as what you experienced? Were there?
Advantages of us being involved.
Yeah, how did you benefit the civilian populations?
Well,
Were there any moments that you thought that you were doing good?
I thought I was there to do good, and I remember that village. I mentioned went in and they left my platoon to defend it, and it was on a high hill. And I remember setting up one evening there and watching the sun go down. And I said, this is a beautiful country. It's kind of torn from the bombs and everything. I said, someday I'd like to come back here when the war is over and see it. And at that time, I was convinced we'd win the war. I think we really kind of won the war and it was given away. But so I felt like we were doing good. And we certainly wanted to help people, and they were very poor.
You were talking about how you felt about
Yeah.
your involvement in Vietnam and how you benefited the populations.
And that's an interesting question, because recently I met and made a friend with another OSU alum who was an infantry officer a couple of years ahead of me, and his first tour was in it as an advisor to Vietnamese units, and we've talked about this. And we Americanized the war. You read history, and first we were over there to advise the South Vietnamese and probably to give them materiel and aid. And as I've read history, a lot of the commanders were big. We got to get American troops in here and deal with this. Well, that escalated the war, is one way to look at it. It certainly escalated the war. It caused more Chinese support, North Vietnam to do certain things. He feels, and it makes me think about it a lot, and I think I can agree with it, that if we had left it more to the South Vietnamese and stayed in the role of advisors, maybe so the war wouldn't have escalated and become so devastating. I think more bombs were dropped, more ordnance was dropped on Vietnam than in World War II. I've heard that. It's certainly a plenty, and people are still getting maimed by booby traps. By ordnance that didn't explode today. I've published his book, his accounts, and I've looked at other manuscripts, other alum, and I think so many wanted to go do the right thing. They felt it was something good to do. I think the war could have been waged differently and more effectively, and probably part of that would have been to try to stay in the role of advisors as much as possible. Now, I mentioned helping prepare almost 800 soldiers to go train the new Iraqi army. I'm anxious to go talk to those friends and see how they feel about the recent news. Yeah. Not only that a lot of the Iraqi army had retreated, but that I heard the other day on NPR that they had not treated the civilians in Mosul and some of these places so well either. I think the Middle East is different in that there's all this sectarian violence and divisions on religious grounds. That wasn't the case in Vietnam. I think it was ideological differences mainly. I think most of the people just would like to live and be left alone, but you can't avoid getting caught up in that. And I often equate it to what would happen if an army invaded the United States, and those of us civilians here, and we weren't in the military, but we often had large number of enemy troops coming through and saying they were trying to stop a popular uprising. And imagine being in that situation and what we would be like. But one thing you cannot do, you cannot avoid being involved in it, and you pick a side. I think the people there we were trying to help, we were going to leave after a while, and they had to live there forever. And probably, I'm sure this happened to many Vietnamese, if they supported the South Vietnamese government, they were paid the price when we left. I think the big tragedy is we went there, we escalated that war, and then we abandoned them. not only, we left their army supposedly, and I think it was and supplied, but then the funding was cut later. So I think that's the big tragedy, that the context there was different than what's happened in Iraq. It was the Cold War, and there are many excellent books you can read, and that I refer my Vietnam veteran friends to if they're worried about what we did there. You can be shown that at least it gave the signal that we were going to resist those activities in countries. When we pulled out and then we cut the funding, there was more aggressive things happened in Africa and so forth. I think and now that's the big question after what we've gone through now. Are we ready to withdraw and quit being sort of the world leader or the policeman of the West, the leader of the free world, so to speak, or whatever you want to say?
Well, history certainly repeats itself.
Yes, history repeats itself. Of course, in 10 years, this will be forgotten, very possibly. I was opposed to going to Iraq because of my Vietnam experience, and because what happened, I was afraid this is what would happen. What has happened? Because our government, our form of country and government is not well suited to fight these kind of wars. Frankly, I remember when I got out of the field, I went into the battalion talk on the fire base, the Tactical Operations Center, as a liaison officer, and basically 12 hours off and 12 hours on at the talk, and I learned a lot there. Because I saw from the battalion level how it operated, and it's a different perspective than out in the field. Mm-hmm. That maybe it's more important to get your reports in than how you lead the company. I learned a lot about organizations that way. But I remember sitting there in the talk in the middle of the night and hearing the reports and so forth, and a program maybe with. I don't know if it was Vietnamese music or Chinese music, and I was listening to the music and stuff, and I thought, we're here just for a year and we want to get back to the good life, and these people are here for it, for the long term, and I think they are more committed than we are. They certainly they lost a lot more people than we did and killed, and they felt, rightly or wrongly, they had a cause that it didn't matter. It was worth the lives. That's another part of our society, how it's progressed and the lifestyle we had. How can I say this nicely? I don't think we're prepared for the sacrifices of something like that unless we were invaded or something. Mm-hmm. Even World War II, to me, as clear-cut as it was, Americans were becoming war weary after 4 years of that horrendous sacrifice, and this country's sacrifice was nothing compared to the Soviet Union, for example, or England, or France. So,
well, you bring up an interesting point, and I'd like to ask a follow-up question about that. It has been argued that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist first and a communist secondary. What were your personal observations at the time of the enemy? Well, obviously you weren't fighting a lot of NVA, but it was VC. What was your observations of them? How did you judge them?
Well, we did have encounters with NVA.
Oh,
okay. We were always looking for them. I'd say fortunately they avoided us if they could, but we did have some NVA. At that time I was there were not as many. I saw the enemy in a very antagonistic, hateful way at that time. I don't see them that way now. Maybe that's very common. I see World War II veterans talk about, and this was in Europe, the Germans anyway. I don't. Matter of fact, I went to Luxembourg for the Battle of the Bulge reunion, and there was a German soldier and American. They were veterans and friends. Mm-hmm. So I see it differently. But then I guess I don't know if you could call it hatred. It was akin to it though, and I felt like for example, I'd never be taken prisoner. You would shoot Americans, right? They didn't really have facilities for prisoners, probably. So it was I definitely clear as the enemy. There was no compassion. They were to be killed if possible.
Was this an ideological framework, or was this from your personal experience that developed this animosity toward the enemy?
Yeah, it would have been ideological, because I really didn't know it. Now, there were the Chuhoys, the part of the Chuhoy program. We called them Kit Carsons. They had been the enemy, but now we were friends.
Right.
So back as a young man then, I would not have committed atrocities or anything. I know they took a VC in once, and I think it's a good policy. The American soldiers, we just generally didn't deal with prisoners. They immediately called in South Vietnamese, and they were interrogating this guy in a way that I felt sympathy for him, and so I guess my feelings were not well defined, probably.
How did you judge their value of life in South Vietnam? The South Vietnamese forces, how did they value life?
The government of South Vietnam,
or the
North Vietnamese, the enemy.
The enemy, or the government of South Vietnam, whatever you care.
I couldn't say if I had an opinion on that. We saw South Vietnamese units occasionally. You didn't get units too close together in case there would be. How they valued life, did you say?
Yeah, I've heard that another veteran's observations that there was no value of life in Vietnam. Would you care to comment on that?
I don't think I'd agree with that. I think they're human beings that value. I think for example, I do think the North Vietnamese regime was willing to sacrifice all the lives it took to have their ideology spread or enforced. I don't think Ho Chi Minh, I think he was a committed communist. He certainly followed their methods and their purpose. I don't think he was I know some in this country view him as a kind of a hero, maybe like they do Che Guevara. So I don't think life was valued in that instance. I think when you get up to my personal view, high-level leadership, there's a level of abstraction about life. It's different than we're good friends and I see you kill versus being high up in the government or the bureaucracy and the numbers, troops being killed. But that's an impersonal level, I think. I mean, that's my bias. Governments get us into wars, and individual soldiers pay the price. Maybe that's funny for me to be saying that, but nothing ever good comes out of a war much. I think Karl von Clausewitz, we follow his principles today. The Prussian general, Napoleonic Wars, who wrote on war. War is simply politics by another means, the most drastic means. So I don't say World War II to me was absolutely necessary. These were the Axis powers were ruthless. They were murdering people, tens of thousands. I don't see how anybody can say, although some argue maybe, we shouldn't have been involved. Now we get into these wars, Vietnam and the other, and you certainly wonder, especially with the outcome. In any event, I think Congress should, Vietnam was a Tonkin Gulf resolution. I think any war should be a clear declaration of war, certainly for the soldiers' sake, if nothing else. The country ought to enter it determined to see it through. I think the veterans today are bound to look at this and say, we made all these sacrifices, and for what, to see what's going on. I think this is even worse than Vietnam, probably. I'm rattling on, but
to talk a little bit about the American soldiers themselves, it seems to me that you're from a working class background. Would you feel that the number of men under your command were working class as well?
good question. My platoon, I think we were I guess you could say that, however you want to define working class, socioeconomic level, but several of the soldiers in my platoon had been to college, some. And the ones I've tracked later were, some later became, teachers in college and stuff. My platoon sergeant was a U.S. congressman. His dad was a major general in the Army, yet he chose to be an enlisted soldier and be there. I don't think I know some of the thought is that Vietnam was only poor soldiers or minorities. The highest casualty rate of any group I've read were young Catholic men. Have you ever heard that?
No.
Yeah.
I've heard the statistics on the African American
They would be, yeah. I think I have read that that's a misnomer, that percentage-wise, African American were not especially out of line. Maybe you've heard different. I guess you can read all kinds of things, but I have read a lot about the casualty figures. Vietnam had about over 7% casualties, which is, other than the American Civil War, is the highest casualty rate. Now, it's hard to figure, are those combatants in country or whatever, and the numbers I saw haven't revealed that, but I think for people like in the infantry and the combat arms in the field, although you see a lot of Purple Hearts among guys who were in transportation or whatever, because it was an insurgency, and like you see today, you see military police or all kinds being casualties. But anyway, certainly it was a high casualty rate, probably.
Can you talk a little bit about working with minority groups in your command, under your command? You hear a lot about fraggings, and you hear a lot about African American militancy, and.
Now, I thought I had several African American soldiers in my platoon. I remember. You did not see, I've thought about this, racial animosity. I did one time have a white soldier come up to me and start trying to talk about the N-word, that I wouldn't have anything to do with that. But for the most part, you didn't see that. And I know the field first sergeant once was mad at one or two of these African American soldiers for something, and I kind of took up for him, and they thanked me for it. I mean, it was not racial inspired. I think it was something that he thought they should have done. And I know that when a couple of these soldiers were due to leave the field, all the soldiers, white and African American, urged them to stay in the perimeter, don't go out on patrol and stuff. I mean, I think they were supportive. Now, it would have been a bigger problem then than I think in the Army today. From what I've seen, soldiers, when they risk in an infantry outfit, I think risk death together. It's a bonding that trumps that kind of thing, I think, typically. And of course, racism was more prevalent back in the 60s. It was I came from an Aryan background. I had to learn a lot of things about that, racism. The Army, I think, is that experience trains you. You take care of soldiers, no matter what. They're a soldier, they're a soldier. So, no, I did not experience that or fragging. I know people who were objects of fragging, not in the outfit I was in. We had a great company commander who was African American, by the way, and everybody loved him. They called us Happy Company, and it was at the battalion, I learned later, because we got in the national news the day of the moratorium on the Vietnam War. That's the day that I told you my platoon, we killed these two VC, and there was a reporter back at division headquarters who happened to, nothing was going on that day. He heard that. They flew him out. And then he was following us, and then as soon as we hit that second booby trap, he took off. But our picture of our company was in Life magazine. I have it in my office. And a story about the moratorium, and it mentions our company. And it's inaccurate in some ways, but we made national news. I tell people we were happy company of the hard luck division, and the title of an article was soldiers making ripples in Vietnam. I said we were happy company of the hard luck division making ripples in Vietnam. Made national news, but the company commander, I found out we were called in that article happy company, and it was because of him. He's a great guy. I invited him to my retirement ceremony because he lives in Virginia. I didn't even think of him as being African American, and there could have been soldiers that felt that way. That one came up to me. But another favorite saying I have is when you're with a bunch of guys that are carrying an M16 rifle and a bunch of grenades and stuff, you don't make racial slurs.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it was not a problem in our company. I guess they did have some problems in Vietnam with that. Given the age and the time, you can think, well, you can understand that. But I think that tended to happen more in the rear areas and stuff where they didn't have the pressure to take care of each other, maybe.
And to stay alive.
Yeah. Oh, well, go ahead.
Oh, well, you mentioned journalism, and you have a background in mass communications or media communications. What were your thoughts on the media in Vietnam and how they portrayed the war?
Oh, great question, because I've thought of that a lot, understanding journalism and so forth. I think, first of all, I'll say, when I listen to any report anymore, I don't assume it's accurate. I think it's just a perspective of, first of all, a war is so complex and so vast. What's something like Vietnam or Afghanistan, you're getting a reporter's perspective. I don't think the media can really claim to be unbiased and necessarily accurate. I have seen some very good programs. NPR, who had some bad stuff about Vietnam, recently had a thing about My Lai, and I thought it was very well done. And they did kind of go into what could cause that to happen. I saw some excellent stuff by reporters on Afghanistan. Soldiers, they're down at the small unit level trying to capture it. But this is a crude attempt to try to explain a highly complex phenomena. I remember one observation I can tell you. You've heard of Khe Sanh, and the Marines were surrounded. And now, when I was a young cadet here, I read Hell in a Very Small Place by Bernard Fall, and which was about Dien Bien Phu, where the French were surrounded, and is, of course, similar to Khe Sanh. Now, all of a sudden, journalists got that book, and they were suddenly, as I saw it, reading the reports, felt they were experts on it, and they were saying, oh, the American Army's trapped here, or the Marines are trapped. But, they didn't realize we had what the French didn't have, a total air force that was totally capable. I did get obviously touchy there, but I think they sent the 1st Cav Division in as later as the commander of that division. The name slips me. He was at Fort Bragg later, but and I think they staged a relief mainly just for the public media. Tet of 68 is another example of where the VC was totally decimated after that. You can even read that North Vietnamese made the VC units lead in the attack so they would be decimated, so they wouldn't have political opposition when they took the country over. Have you ever heard that?
I have heard that.
Yeah. It wound up a surprise, but a total defeat for the enemy, and yet that was the turning point in the war in public opinion, and I think the North Vietnamese realized that.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up Tet along with Khe Sanh, in that Khe Sanh could have been a ruse planned by the North Vietnam to launch Tet, and we the American public, predicted another Dien Bien Phu. How did the media affect the anti-war demonstrations, and how aware were you of the anti-war movement?
Well, we were in that news article that was talking about the moratorium on the war. The reason we were in it, a platoon leader in another platoon had different, we were friends, but his political views probably were a little different than mine and everybody else's. But we were Charlie Company, and we wore a black scarf with a C on it for Charlie. The legend is they had ambushed a NVA or VC courier who had, among other things, this bolt of black cloth, and these scarves were made out of it. And anyway, so he read about the moratorium, and he got the soldiers to tie these, 6 of his soldiers to tie these bands around their arm to simulate sympathy to the moratorium. And that reporter came out, he saw that, and that's what prompted him to really put that in, that American soldiers were out doing their duty fighting the war, but wearing black armbands in support of the moratorium. Well, it was only 6 soldiers. Not most of the company was just going on its way. I mean, most soldiers were concerned about survival, you know. I think the soldiers had all kinds of views, but they were willing to go do their duty, you know. My views at the time, I resented all that. I resented the way they treated soldiers coming back. I think my view, they made a heck of a PR mistake on the people who supposedly opposed the war by taking it out on the soldiers. You don't see that today, I don't think, and I think for that reason. There's nothing wrong with the idea of, you know, opposing the war, but I always thought it certainly is nice to be opposed to the war and stay at home and be with the girls than go go to Vietnam, you know. But my view, you can tell I have a bit of bitterness about that, but then I'm a product of my experience and my time.
Did you ever experience any anti-war demonstrations against you? I mean, you mentioned not supporting the troops. How exposed to that segment of society were you?
Not much. I was not spit on when I got back to the country. Matter of fact, when I got back, all my flights were delayed and all messed up getting back to the States. And when I got in, I think it's an airport in Seattle or someplace, coming back, I was on my own, but you wore your uniform then. And a Vietnam vet and his girlfriend, he came up, he said, he saw my combat infantryman's badge, so he sat and talked to me. I didn't have nobody in the airport. Later, because I left active duty and came back here to OSU, there were people who would make snide remarks and stuff about how could you do something like that.
You're at OSU.
Yeah. Well, OSU is interesting. When I left it, very conservative campus, you saw a few people in Nuru suits and kind of, but you know, very conservative. But I have had friends who followed me in ROTC, and eventually there were demonstrations. They stopped wearing their uniform. They wouldn't drill in public, and I was told. So I think that movement was a kind of, it's like a lot of things, a popular thing to do. So if you were going to be with it, you'd be a part of that. That's kind of the way I see it.
What year did you come back to OSU?
Yeah, I left. I was a little over 4 years on active duty. I was back at Bragg in SF. For many reasons, I decided I was going to leave the Army, and I came back to finish my master's degree here, and then got stuck. You can get stuck in Stillwater very easily. But then I got in reserves for money, and then it was, of course, the war was still going on. You had a lot of people in the reserves that were there to avoid going to Vietnam rather than serve their country. I had the privilege to see that totally change over the years. So I kind of drifted around there. and I got in and out of the reserves a couple times. And I met my second wife, and things kind of changed for me. And then I got committed to the training, and the being with soldiers to me is the greatest thing you can do. The camaraderie. I mean, it's been a blessing to my life. The experiences I've had from it, and everything, and of course Vietnam, and it affected my whole life and outlook on life.
Well, you mentioned your wife, and I'd like to know a little bit about the effect on your social life and your family life. Could you talk a little bit about your first marriage? Did your military experience have an effect on that? We can avoid that.
No. I think I became a little disillusioned with the Army. My marriage was part of that, I think, for me to leave. All I can say is I did things I would do differently now that I've had years to experience things and outlook on things. And did what I experienced in Vietnam affect my marriage? Probably did.
Even if just being away for so long, right?
Yeah, it's not, I was selfish of me to ask her to get married when I could have. She wanted to have children before I left. At least I thought that was not a good idea. But I think I'm a blessed person. I don't feel that. It's affected my views on things, and I have pretty strong views as a result. But I'm not dead. I wasn't even wounded. Miraculously. I'm a blessed person, and the Army has turned out for me to be a very positive experience for the people I've met in it and got to know. I know it's sad for so many soldiers it's not like that, and their experience in it is a tragedy. But then to me the Army, of course, is a great tradition and institution. Is it perfect? No. And bad things happen, yes. And it's too bad we have to fight any wars. Most of the Army is not combat. It's training, it's the camaraderie. By nature, the great majority of it's not that. Lately, these soldiers over the last 10 years have had to be deployed so much and everything. It's a tragedy what soldiers are going through, and all the suicides and everything.
Did you ever experience any psychological problems on your reintegration, PTSD, or anything that you could?
That I'm not aware of.
Any social anxiety, fitting in with people who didn't contribute to the war, such as the reserves?
Yeah. I think maybe my political views are strongly affected by this experience, and but I think I'm mellowing over the years. People ask me if I had anything like post-traumatic stress disorder or anything like that, and I don't feel like I have. Mistakes I've made in my life have just been through stupidity. I went, but I went into the Army with a certain expectation. I had always read history. I had read a lot about the military. I think more than the typical person. I had a certain viewpoint about what it was going to be like and what could happen, and I felt just fortunate to survive it. And I did so many dumb things as a lieutenant, and yet to spend 37 years in the Army and get through it, I found great leaders and great people in it. I do know people that have had problems, and like that one soldier that he and I kind of formed a bond that I put in for he rescued a baby. He saved a baby's life. He was from Adair County. He was an enlisted soldier in another platoon, but they called him Flash. We found out we lived just close together growing up. So he liked to go with my platoon because we kind of had this connection. And one day we were up getting into the mountains looking for the NBA, which fortunately we usually didn't find. But a scout helicopter called a Loach started firing up there, and they said they had found some people with a cache, and they sent my platoon up. We got up there, and there were hooches and stuff in this concealed area, and definitely caches. You know, they would put food and munitions in a place, so when they did do an offensive, they could count on these areas. But they left people there, obviously, to guard them, and one was a woman. So we got up there, and this two dead men and a dead woman had been stuffed down in this hole, a tunnel. The place was, tunnels all over the place. They had been fighting for years, and they had these areas. And you could see the bodies, and you could hear a baby crying down there. And immediately, we were saying what to do. I was trying to put out security just in case. And, we're always concerned about booby traps. And Flash said, I'll go down and get the baby. And we had this, the Chew Hoy, the Kit Carson with us. And he went ballistics. He said, no, they'll have a booby trap down there. This is just a way to get some more of your soldiers killed. And yet we kept hearing that baby cry. So I felt like something had to be done. So I had soldiers sling their rifle slings together, and we tied to the foot of the first person, got back and drug the body out. Well, nothing went off. So we did that with all the bodies. The woman was obviously the mother of this child, but I'm not sure they would have taken the baby with them anyway, the ones who ran off. So you could still hear the baby. He went down and got the baby. So I wrote him up for a Silver Star, and they downgraded to a Bronze Star for Valor. So he was a hero. But later, a few months later, he was with his platoon, and I said you never saw military-age males. And in the distance, they saw some young men, what looked like, running away from them. So he immediately fired a shot, Flash did. And when he got up there, he had killed an old man. And this bothered him tremendously. And then when we got back to the States, he did get through the war. And I went out to that little store in Cookson, Oklahoma, and they said, there's a guy here looking for you. He said you were together in Vietnam, and I realized it was Flash. But later, and I've seen pictures where he had gone to reunions and stuff later. But later he died under unusual circumstances, and I wonder if he committed suicide, But he was a hero, and yet he did that one thing, and it troubled him, the rest of his life, and he might have committed suicide over it. I'm not sure. So I feel fortunate I didn't do something stupid, or something not stupid, just something I couldn't live with, which could easily be, and it all depends on the individual again, what you can deal with and how you feel about life and the kind of person you are. I dream more about that kind of stuff now, and I have a little more negative outlook than I used to, than when I was young and very busy. You follow me here? I mean, occupied with life, raising a family and other things in my career. Now that I have more time to reflect on things, and I look back on things I did and wish I had done differently, there's certainly the tactical mistakes I made, that technical that resulted in soldiers being hurt. I tried to calculate the casualties for my platoon. It's hard to do for a small unit coming in and out, soldiers coming in and out. I could go as high as 30% or 10%, I'm not sure. When I was there, I also was the mortar platoon leader. And we had a friendly fire casualty right after I took that. Guys said, and you mentioned racial problems. These two soldiers were firing H&I fires, harassment and interdiction with the mortar around our perimeter at night. And they made a dumb mistake and elevated the gun too high, and the round landed right on the perimeter, and it killed 2 African American soldiers. And that's when a racial incident almost occurred in the company. And you know, you look at stuff like that, could I have prevented that? You know, but I had just taken over the platoon. But over the years, I've tacked that up to, you know, I heard other veterans say this on television, World War II, you know, certainly training is important, but the great majority is luck. You know, luck about being a casualty or something, because it's such helter-skelter. Pardon?
Sorry to interrupt. Did you have any good luck charms? Or did you believe in superstition or anything like that?
I guess I thought I was invincible. I didn't think. There were a few instances, usually something happens, it happens in a hurry and it's over pretty quickly. Small arms fire, a booby trap goes off. If something is sustained, if it keeps going on, then fear builds in. And I'm sure, and after you're there longer and you see casualties and stuff, you can develop a fear. But I look back, people are very different. And I've seen this in people, soldiers. Some are afraid from day one on. I think if you have a highly active imagination and you start visualizing bad things happening to you, you know, it's, and they talk about when you're young, you think you're invincible. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. As an older man, I realize I would be a lot different now. Mm-hmm. But also, I think I just kind of had a faith that that carried me through pretty much. That I look back and I thought, what was I thinking about? But I didn't dwell on it. I certainly didn't dwell on the idea. But I've seen soldiers that it ate them alive. They worried constantly about it. But then I've seen some tremendously brave people who know right what to do. You probably see this in police work, other type things that call for being able to deal with sudden situations and have the presence of mind to react. I did think of this. I'm more the tactician. I would be more thinking ahead, trying to think ahead. I'm not one of those get the Medal of Honor because I acted so effectively. But it's interesting to see people, how different we are as human beings. It's remarkable. Same culture, maybe similar backgrounds, but people are so different. And of course, the Army takes people and tries to mold them into a pretty uniform thing, but there's still the individual person there. There's to take into account. So, but I think that's a strength to let individuals lead at their level and avoid a bureaucratic approach to an organization like the military.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah, it does. Even not coming from a military background, that makes a lot of sense. How do you personally memorialize or honor the fallen under your command or in general? Well, I'll start it off like this. Have you been to the memorial in Washington?
Mm-hmm.
What were your impressions of that?
Oh, I'm very proud of it. You know, it was very controversial.
It was.
And this young lady came up with the design. It was opposed a lot, but I think it's turned into a great memorial to those who sacrificed. They did put a statue there finally, which is kind of neat. So I know I had somebody take my picture I went by myself one time when I was in D.C. and well, anyway, it is moving. So, you know, you try to stay emotionally detached from it. For Vietnam veterans, I think, who were so vilified, you know, I think it has a special meaning. Interestingly, that they only recently did a World War II memorial. World War II veterans got to go to it. Korean War has a pretty nice memorial to it there, and it's a squad of soldiers going up a hill and so forth. I think the statue is a nice addition to the Vietnam Memorial because it does show. I heard a nice description of it. The soldiers, it depicts them, their expressions and stuff. There's one also to women, to nurses there that had been added. That's nice. How do I memorialize? My little rifle company every July has a reunion in St. Louis, and I keep meaning to go to that. And I really need to. I think I know the company commander that I really liked, I had 2 company commanders there. He's been back, and I know some guys in my platoon have, and I really need to go. It seems like there's always something that comes up. I went on the internet recently and found that one of the medics is doing a book about the people in our company or something. I donated to that. Only way I can memorialize them is think back about them. And I remember one young guy. I was always very conscious of trying to keep people spread out and not bunch up, and be careful what you do when we stop. And because if a lot of times I felt the enemy they had the leisure to sit there and watch, and it seemed to me sometimes if a platoon was bad about letting people bunch up and horse around together and not be alert, they could actually pinpoint them. You see casualties constantly. Well, anyway, after I got out of the field and I was in the fire base, if our company would come on the hill, guys from my platoon, guys I knew would come in. We had a bunker and we'd talk. But they started taking more casualties after I got out of the field from booby traps and others. And I know they were just out in kind of brushy country, and some guys were just BSing there. And you take a break, you don't think much about it, but whether it was a BC outfit or NVA, I'm not sure, they actually were able to go up and set up a machine gun, get close enough, and they fired up these guys, and they killed this one guy that I had known, and we were talking about that in my bunker on the fire base, and they were saying how hard he had died. But that he, when they came up on the hill, he had ordered some books from the States about, kind of self-improvement courses and stuff, and how he was looking forward to get back in the States and how he wanted to improve himself and stuff, and that was especially touching to me. And just like my family being surprised, that's why I think veterans don't talk much about this stuff. First of all, you don't think anybody's interested, and then if they ask questions, they're usually their attention leaves pretty quickly. I guess they want to hear like a movie, maybe a Rambo movie or something, a lot different than that. But people honestly don't know the questions to ask, probably, what it was like. I don't think it's simple to answer those kind of questions. And I know I want to talk to my family more about this. I think they are interested in hearing. I think I'll be better off to write about it than talk about it, so they can read it as they want to. But back to your question, how do I memorialize? That's a good question. I ought to do more. I do try to do things for veterans and to help them. I'm working with a lady, since I do have a publishing business, who wants to write a book about post-traumatic stress disorder and its effect on families. And I told you about that earlier. She's trying to get a grant. I think it would be a great book. And of course, the suicides are such a concern. And I published one of her books, and I'm looking forward to her getting to work on that. And the thing is to help the soldiers today to get through. That's where I feel like the need is right now, that are struggling with what they went through and how to deal with it. And I know I talked to a guy on the phone today. I was key in organizing the Oklahoma Military Hall of Fame. They're very nice. They give an award in my name, and so I helped identify some people for it. And I just found out this morning who got the award that's going to be given in November. And he is a special ops soldier who has started a program, and it's here in Oklahoma, and for special ops veterans, ways to help them deal with post-traumatic stress disorder and stuff. And it's basically going out and camping, I think, as I see, and going pheasant hunting. He was organizing a pheasant hunt. I talked to him just this morning, and I thought, gosh, this he deserves this award. He's doing all this. I should be doing more to help veterans, you know. To deal with this mystery of how to help people cope with this. I did read a great article by a lady in something I was reading, and she's writing a book on it, but she said suicide and these problems, it's kind of like the best combatant of a suicide is the strong cultural taboos about doing that. I loved her viewpoint that soldiers are used to supporting each other and helping each other. So the tendency, she said, to commit suicide, and she's a psychologist and studied this a lot more than me, but it's a passing emotion, and the person needs to get through that. And as fellow soldiers, we need to help other soldiers get through that and when a soldier commits suicide, or a member of any community, but a soldier, it's like telling the other soldiers it's okay to do this. It cuts away at the taboo. So I thought that's an urgent thing to help soldiers today get through what they're dealing with. And
if there were, for example, a veteran listening to this transcript, or reading this transcript, or listening to your interview, and you had advice to give them about how to overcome their battles with their war experience, what would that be?
Well, there's the example of Flash, who I don't know for sure how he died. It's funny, on the back of my mind, I always had the feeling, because he was such a get out there and do it kind of guy. I always somehow had the feeling something bad might happen to him. And I looked back and thought, well, he went by there to find me that day at Cookson. I was still on active duty, and I didn't find him, but should I have? But of course, I didn't realize what could happen. But I think to get with people you can talk to and get support to get through it. Although I've seen people that no amount of talking seems to help. You certainly get professional help. I know for Vietnam veterans, I did attend a class or two where veterans talk about their experiences and so forth. The VA was sponsoring those. I don't think, you have to have friends and supportive friends. And I think those of us who are veterans need to try to help provide that support. As far as advice, I don't assume I could understand maybe what everybody's gone through. I have a insight into it, but what a given individual's dealing with, I'm not sure. I wouldn't presume to say you shouldn't feel this way, or you can be strong and overcome this. All I could do is try to offer support for them. But I think life is a mystery, and it's painful at times. It's imperfect beyond imagination. It's unfair. But it is to look for the enjoyment, things we can enjoy in life, and look for reasons to living. Now, a spouse, as I found out, or a family, if somebody doesn't have anybody, they need to reach out and find other people, reasons to live, and to push back negative emotions that may be bothering somebody, because, and frankly, religion or a philosophy of life or something, because I think life is a precious gift, and not all of us, it's not fair. I see people who, I've been blessed, but I see people who have terrible circumstances. But the thing to do is look for what we can benefit from life, what we can enjoy about it, and I think it's different for different people. What this guy I talked to this morning is doing, I hope to go see him and find out more about what he's doing.
Well, it seems that
there are programs to help people, and there need to be more. And I would think for a soldier, it would be the support of other soldiers who kind of understand what they're dealing with. It surprises me. They had an interesting film here at OSU recently, and it was about a program for wounded warriors to go mountain climbing. They were mountain climbing, and they had one of the participants there, and but yet one of these with post-traumatic stress disorder was not a combat soldier. And I think you made that observation. Again, I said people are different. You see people act totally different, so you cannot assume that everybody fits in the same mold, and some experience that might not bother me at all might bother somebody else greatly. So we are curious and marvelous creatures. So there's no single prescription for a person. I think they have to do that themselves, come to terms with it for themselves. I'm rambling here, sorry.
No problem.
But it's not an easy question.
No, it's not, and it's open-ended. It seems that throughout your 40 years of hindsight, you've reflected on this and come to some profound observations, in my opinion. What would you, this might be a two-part question, what steps would the society need to recognize this in their veterans, and what advice would you give society to approach this? And the second part of that question is, what steps does the government need to take care of these veterans?
Well, that's a good question. I was reading an article the other day, and the person, it was commentary, but commented, well, we give lip service to support the veterans, but when it gets down to it, it's just a passing thing for everybody else, kind of like the war. It's business as usual. Oh, yeah, there's a war going on. Too bad what happened in the Veterans Administration. I think General Shinseki is a great man and somebody soldiers admire. Things change so much. We go through so many phases. Before 9/11, I remember preparing him, leading and preparing the new Army for the future. But certainly the Veterans Administration, this is to me, bureaucracies do, I think maybe privatizing a lot of what the VA does, although government contractors, who knows. There are lots of people suffering besides veterans, but veterans have stood up, these young men and women, to serve their country. I know going to training, when the Army became professional, it suddenly, and unlike the draftee Army or the military, it was not a bad occupation with pay and so forth to be in. I saw lots of young people from poor backgrounds get into the military to have a better future. And then that's not everybody, but are we letting, I go back to the old Vietnam argument, I think we had a lot from all social classes I've read that fought in Vietnam. I wonder today, though, with the professional military, because it was a draft military then.
Mm-hmm.
But if today we're not truly moving toward letting the poor fight our wars, and make the sacrifices, and I personally believe maybe national service of various kinds is a good thing. But I do believe a large bureaucracy like the VA has become is not going to have good results. I think this young man I was talking to that started this program for veterans who are struggling. He deals with special ops. Anybody who's in special ops is invited to do. And I'm sure entrepreneurs like that can only affect small numbers. But I think they could be encouraged, and if there are government grants to help, a proliferation of those kind of programs might be good. Any bureaucracy, government or whatever, that becomes large becomes unresponsive, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it in the Army, what can happen, micromanaging and so forth. I think individuals, most of the soldiers I saw were took pride in doing a good job, and all they need is a little encouragement. And if you could push down to the lowest level of the unit, the people there, if you can go give them encouragement, not always, it needs to be monitored, but let them come up with the solutions. So I would have to say, with government programs, try to decentralize as much as possible and have a program like the military. The Army's supposed to be in combat. They use the motto, centralized planning, decentralized execution. I think don't just use people like robots. Let them, encourage them to be innovative and address the problem at the closest level possible. So that's kind of a general approach to what to do for veterans. I think it's going to have to be other veterans to help get in the lead, to help veterans can best understand. I'm not sure we can count on other people doing a great deal, because there are other people with needs in the country, all kinds of things. We're a wealthy nation, and should be a way to figure out how to address human needs with the wealth we've got. Unfortunately, politics get in the way, and the issues are used as a way to get in office as opposed to helping people, in my view. Unfortunately. But gosh, I wish I had more answers. I think about that all the time, and what could I do maybe to help veterans, and maybe I could publish more things to help people that are useful as books. But I think probably people are more different than they are alike, and while there are commonalities, it probably, again, that argues for decentralizing things so people can be addressed more as individuals than as large things. Maybe that doesn't make sense to a lot of people, what I'm trying to say, but it's a principle I see.
I see the applicability to larger or other segments of society.
They're saying, how are they going to fix the VA? And I'm not sure. Once something gets... I've talked to veterans, though, that have very positive experiences with the VA, but it probably varies from where you go, and yet I've always heard rumors about some of this ugly stuff that is reported going on. So again, people become entrenched in a bureaucracy too, and it's hard to change. Very hard to change, especially for one person. I hate to see General Shinseki reputation suffer from this, and I know nothing about it and what he could be blamed for. All I can think is probably pretty darn hard to come to terms with what was happening. But go ahead. What other questions do you have? I ramble on here.
Well, you mentioned that approach to your children through your writing. If there was something that you wanted your children to know about your experiences, what would that be?
My military experiences?
Sure.
Well, I've never thought of that before. I do plan to write this account, not just for my children, but for other people down the line that I'll never know. Because, like I said, I had that ancestor that was in the Battle of New Orleans, and it would be so valuable to me. Most will probably not find it interesting, but my daughter has been asking for me to write down things. And probably, now that you pose the question off the top of my head, I'd say it's what I've learned about people by the experiences I've had, how different people are, how special people are. There are extremes of people. Some people are terrible, and who knows why. But most people I encounter, most soldiers were, and some especially were just. It was a joy to know. It's been a joy to know them. So that's basically what our world boils down to, is people and our relationships with them. So, a good question. I never thought about it so much. What would I pass on? I guess that's a good point. I'll probably try to express what I've learned about people. Don't give up on people.
Absolutely. So you're born in Oklahoma, and you took 3 degrees from OSU. What does Oklahoma mean to you?
I'm very proud of Oklahoma. I publish a number of titles. I call it a regional series, but it's basically Oklahoma in the region. We've started a new marketing process with the help of my daughter on our publishing firm. It's called Inbound, our digital marketing, our content marketing is a part of it. We're including videos where we interview authors and blog posts, and I'm looking forward to that, doing more of that, because I was getting a little tired. I know I look like a young man, but I'm actually kind of old, and you do get tired of things, but this is exciting. So, but I was mainly focusing on identified 4 niches in education, like scholarly writing and faculty development. Wanted to focus on, and one was healthful life strategies, based on this lady who's doing the book, published one of her books, but wants to do one about post-traumatic stress disorder effect on families. I thought that'd be a nice area. But I do have this series about Oklahoma, and some of the authors are around here, and I'm thinking, I would really enjoy getting them to do blog posts and interviewing them on Google Hangout and stuff about things about Oklahoma. It's a remarkable state, our heritage. Right now I'm reading a book by a Stillwater resident called When the Wolf Came, and it's about the American Civil War in Oklahoma.
I've heard of that.
It's really an interesting book. It was talk about hard times. If you feel like we're going through a lot, go read that book. The Indian tribes were forced out here. But by 1860, they had built up a nice lifestyle and pretty prosperous. And then the Civil War comes, and not only are they caught up in it, their old splits come back. But it was terrible time, and I have to put it down. It's so bad. But back to your question, we have a remarkable, unique history in Oklahoma, and I enjoy finding out more about that, and I'm proud to be an Oklahoman. I think sometimes we're criticized a lot. Something out recently came out in the newspaper. Oklahoma's number 11 in corruption in government. A heck of a statistic. I think that was more in the past. It's improved, but I'm very defensive about Oklahoma and proud of it since I grew up in it and been such a part of it. And I was down in Austin, and Texas has a cultural center there, and I thought, well, we need more of this in Oklahoma. We need to realize our unique history, things we can be proud in. I think our culture, we have Native Americans, and all kinds. One of my authors, I keep urging him to finish his master's thesis, write it into a book. I'm anxious to publish it, and it's about Muskogee, Oklahoma, and it's about jazz music in Muskogee. Because after the Civil War, which we were just talking to, the Creek Nation, they had slaves, African American slaves, like all the five civilized tribes, the southeastern U.S. tribes, because they came out of the southern culture. But they made the slaves freedmen, or they part of the tribe, let me put it that way, tribal members. Anyway, Muskogee became the thriving African American communities, and so blues and jazz, all that evolved there. And they were actually passing out handbills across the country. Now we're talking about the turn of the century, 1900, for other African Americans to come there. And so it's a book about that and that culture and that scene. And I thought, now that to me is really, because you've heard the song Okie from Muskogee, and that sets a certain thing in people's mind probably about rednecks and whatever. But yet, here's a book about jazz and blues, in Muskogee, Oklahoma. I think that'd be an exciting book to publish.
Well, I think about Vietnam whenever I hear that song myself.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, there's some lines regarding the Vietnam War in that song. If you go back and
I need to go listen to it then.
Very interesting. It's patriotic, actually.
Yeah.
So, is there anything about your time at OSU that you'd like to comment on? Anything that comes to mind?
Well, OSU's been a major part of my life. I worked at OSU for 13 years, and I was editor of the alumni publications. And I did, when they did the Centennial Histories in 1990 series, I wrote the history of the Alumni Association. That research was interesting because it's first when I realized what an institution the size of OSU, the impact it has, because you see what all the alumni go out and do. And I didn't even do justice to capture all that alumni had done. One thing that struck me in the early history, classes began in roughly 1891. For example, the Philippines. A lot of OSU alumni with their agricultural training and the Spanish-American War and the U.S. taking control of the Philippines, a lot of our alumni went to the Philippines initially and were involved in teaching, agricultural methods and so forth, whatever. One of our alumni I've known, his father was taken prisoner in the Philippines when the Japanese invaded at the beginning of World War II, and he died on a prisoner ship. But the guy was telling me, for example, the Filipinos on Mindanao, I think, island, were urging, they had high respect for, he was an OSU grad, they had high respect for him, as the story was told to me, and they were trying to hide him, urging to hide him. And that's a small thing, but those are the things you learn when I would have never thought of that. And that was a small school and just starting to have an impact. I got to meet and know a lot of the alumni that were instrumental. When I was a cadet, I got what was called the Drummond Saber Award. It was a saber they give every year, and a Colonel Drummond. Drummonds are a big family in OSU. Culture, you might say, the Drummonds, and I'm very proud of that saber because it has the Drummond name on it. But, well, you know, I came back. You can't get out of this town if you come back to go to school here, to work here. And, you know, ever since 4-H and I was a kid in the 6th grade, I've been coming to Stillwater. My sister and nephew and niece are coming to visit this weekend, and we're going to show them how much Stillwater's changed, and the university. My gosh, because she was here a while, way back in the late 50s and stuff. So I think they'll enjoy that. But I'm the guy you cut and the blood is orange, you know, bleed orange, that story. And I get too emotional over football games and other things. So other than that, I'm very proud to be Oklahoma State Poke or Aggie or whatever you want to say. And the history, I published a couple of books related to the history of OSU, and I'd like to do a lot more. There needs to be a lot more published about our history and so forth.
Absolutely. Before I wrap up with my closing question, is there anything throughout this interview that you thought of or that you wanted to discuss prior to the interview that perhaps I haven't asked?
Well, no, I think as I thought of anticipating talking to you, and it's been more extensive than I thought it was going to be, I think the main point for me was what I learned. I thought we were just going to talk about Vietnam. You know, it was
My
the most,
apologies.
it was the most pivotal year of my existence, or whatever you want to call it, the most impact on me. And was privileged to serve 37 years in the Army, and I'm not criticizing the Army. I think the Army it did address that. You can read books about what a generation of people, soldiers who came out of Vietnam, they changed the Army. Mm-hmm. And then it became all volunteer or a professional Army, and that changed, that affected it. So that's the point I wanted to make. And the little that I could do, it was devoted to training, because the Army has a saying, other than combat, the next important thing is training, preparing for combat, and that's prepare soldiers to try to do all you can that they will survive on the battlefield. Apparently, and that's what West Point did with this series of films, that I'm one of the 30 films in it, talking about what I've talked to you about, Flash, and so it does address that problem. It's a training film, and that particular one talks about what you can do in an instant on the battlefield you live with the rest of your life. And so West Point is trying to do this and something to address soldiers struggling with issues they've encountered in the service. So that's probably some area that needs a lot more attention on it to help. Obviously, we're not doing enough, and you asked that, what can we do? I wonder about that a lot, but I think there will be people who will be looking more and more at what we can do. But no, I've enjoyed rambling on here incessantly about my experiences. I've never had an experience like this to talk this much about, my experience with things. And I'm a very fortunate person, very blessed with family and stuff. I've done nothing to deserve what has happened, and to me, that's what life is. It's serendipity, kind of. You can work hard and make a difference, but so much is the cards you're dealt and the chance that's taken to you, and that's certainly, talking about combat, that's what we face. Oh, I didn't get to finish one thing. I do know they've studied the Pentagon as some form of national service. I really think it would be good for young people, especially when the economy's like this, to either serve in the military or the Peace Corps or something like the Civilian Conservation Corps. If you hear interviews of people who were in the CCC back in the 30s, they're very similar experiences to the military. You meet people from all over. You get to understand people of different backgrounds and so forth, and appreciate them. you have a sense of accomplishment and service to your community and country. I think that's something that would, in my view, and people will be in shock to hear me say that, but wouldn't be bad for a young person coming out of high school to spend a year or two doing something like that. So I'll end on that controversial point, maybe.
Well, without at the risk of sounding perhaps redundant, I like to ask this question to veterans because war often brings out the best and the worst of humanity. To your experience personally, what are the best and the worst facets of humanity?
Well, let me start with the worst. You do become inured to violence, and you have the potential to doing some awful things, and some people do. The My Lai massacre is a good example of that. Who can believe American soldiers would do that? But it shows you that anything is possible. You go back and look at the Holocaust and Germany and terrible things. We're capable of terrible things, and that's what can come out of war. That's why war, there are always negative consequences from wars. It only, even peace missions to countries by NATO, by the UN, causes all kinds of problems in a society. So it's only a Band-Aid at best to deal with problems. But the good thing is on the personal level, I think, soldiers, it's what they say, people don't fight wars for their country, they do it for the other soldiers in their squad or whatever, and I think that's true. You learn a connection and a loyalty. Most soldiers do, I guess, or they won't fit in. I got to meet Bill Malden. A lot of people won't know who he was, in the Hall of Fame. I remember a special thing I really liked that Bill Malden did. He got 2 Pulitzers for his writings and his cartoons, and he did the Willie and Joe cartoons, and we inducted him in the Oklahoma Military Hall of Fame. Not from Oklahoma, but he was in the 45th Division. That he talked about the quiet dignity of the infantryman, and I really like that. There was a picture that went with it. I mean, the infantryman has nothing, living out of a rucksack. Very bad conditions, difficult, but the thing that the infantryman has going for them is to be in that situation together and their fellow soldiers, and the experience that's possible to get out of that. The camaraderie, like I said, most of the time is not combat, it's training and other things. But what is taught in the military, I think, or in the American Army, and if it's followed properly, again, I've heard soldiers they come out with entirely different things happening to them, but if it works right, the experiences of being with other soldiers and the camaraderie and working together on things and the friendships that are formed are really the positive thing that comes out of it. The most positive thing.
Absolutely. And you don't have to limit yourself to your military career for this question, but what contribution would you want to be remembered for personally?
Well, what contribution? Wow.
To society, even.
I don't know.
What have you done for the betterment of man?
Wow. Well,
I saved the Whopper for last.
I think I did take care of some soldiers. That would have to be high on the list, if not at the top. I wish, I look back, I can see I could have been a better father. I look at my stepson,
I'm so impressed with the father he is, and I look at his example and I say, wow, I didn't live up to that. I'm pretty proud, and more so, of establishing New Forums Press, because that leaves a legacy. And I'm excited about the possibilities in the future for that. It's been a long haul, but maybe there's something there that, in a small way, makes a difference, contributing to faculty development and so forth. I don't know if I need to be remembered for anything. I just, I think that writing that my experiences down, like we've talked about, that the family wants, maybe for later generations, maybe I can say something there that will help them to go through the difficulties of life, because I think everybody's going to have them. Mm-hmm. I would like to think that I was remembered as a soldier who cared for and took care of other soldiers. I didn't always live up to that, I think, but I believed in it, and that's what would be good to be remembered for.
Absolutely.
Of other things. You ask people this tough questions.
I do.
Man.
I do. First, as someone who's benefited from growing up in a democracy in American society, I would like to thank you personally for your service to your nation. And as an oral historian, I'd like to thank you for sharing your story.
Well, I hope the viewers get something out of this. It's interesting.
I'm sure there's a lot to get out of.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.